Gentlemen, thank you both for joining us today. Winston Peters, you've been pushing hard for the Trans-Tasman bubble and for a return also of international students. Can we start by exploring how significant those two factors will be for our recovery?
Well, every factor will be important for our recovery. And so if there is any roadblock or impediment to the return to normalcy, and that impediment is not reasonable, then we should be examining that and trying to get back to business, not as usual, because it'll never be the same after COVID-19, but as fast as possible. And every day or week we delay is a further cost, and that cost can be quite significantly quantified. Our point is we've become possibly the victim of our own success in smashing COVID-19, and we need to now realize the other great crisis growing out of this disaster is the economic worldwide crisis, and one that's also in our nation. So we're asking for, in the case of the Trans-Tasman bubble, to open it, and it should have been, in our view, yesterday. When it comes to export education, well, we've got a chance now to give our export education some real integrity at the top end of the market, where our brand now, because of our success on COVID-19, is much better than it's ever been. We all remember the story of export education, how it got seriously contaminated on the way through, failing to maintain the standards, and we're still perhaps failing to understand what in loco parentis means. When a parent offshore sends a student here, well, those parents are placing this country in their stead as parents, and they seek for us to look after them. We started out with a great deal of integrity. We lost some of it, and we've got a chance now under the COVID-19 recovery plan to get that integrity back again and do better out of it.
Can I ask you, in terms of the Trans-Tasman bubble, is it safe to assume that Tasmania and New South Wales are likely to be the first two states involved?
Well, those are the states with premiers saying they want to start as fast as possible. And the Premier of Tasmania made that statement almost 2 weeks ago. He wants a revival of the 1990s aviation connection between his state and New Zealand. And New South Wales has imaged and repeated a similar message. The tourism industry, of course, in Queensland has seriously repeated that message, though the state government has not. But we can't be delayed by the slowest starter here. We've got to start somewhere, and I think the rest will fix itself up.
What do you think travel will look like as we begin the recovery? Are we talking here possibly 3-hour check-in times?
Well, the protocols for that are being refined as we speak, both within the aviation industry, but by diplomats and foreign affairs and medical people in both New Zealand and Australia, because this work started almost 6 weeks ago. Now, the key when you say that is to ensure that in nothing we do, we imperil the health systems or the risk to the population of Australia or New Zealand. So wearing masks, because they should do, checked out before they got on and checked out when they get off, not quarantined, so they can be tourists from the day they left the airport and get back to normal.
Shane Jones, your focus is the regions. So in the next 12 months, how will COVID-19 impact the regions? How will it be different for those of us living in the cities?
The main narrative over the last decade in New Zealand has been one of escalating house prices, enormous migrant flows, and sadly, low productivity in our key industries. I think in regional New Zealand, Kiwis are going to look to our heartland industries to do a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of generating foreign exchange earnings. We need to ensure that when we train Kiwis to move out of dislocated work environments to new jobs, that we do it and we go back to the foundation values that created the story of New Zealand. Look, a lot of the new jobs in rural New Zealand may not be sexy, but unless we expand the ability of Kiwis to perform, generate economic surpluses, we are going to struggle, and we need the regions pumping.
Shane, in terms of these shovel-ready projects we hear about with infrastructure, are you concerned that there might even be a skills shortage in New Zealand?
Well, it's inevitable that New Zealand is going to have to wean itself off excessive reliance on migration, but any rational politician knows that such a process has to be carefully navigated and managed. We will continue to rely on talented, exceptionally qualified overseas migrants to help New Zealand regrow, but it's my ambition to get every young man, every young woman, indeed people of my generation, born in the late 1950s, to stand up and get going again. And I don't want to turn it into a domestic workforce, migrant workforce, false dichotomy, but the party that we belong to is called New Zealand First.
And you've talked about cutting red tape to get that movement happening a bit faster. Is that still a priority for you?
Yeah, I think that the systems of government administration that have evolved during a time of economic surplus are no longer fit for purpose in the post-COVID recovery phase. We are unfortunately going to have to make some hard and pragmatic decisions, and cutting red tape, which will be dislocating for a whole host of professions who derive their livelihood in managing that red tape. In my view, those days are over.
And can you give an example? The RMA needs some attention, obviously.
Yeah, the Resource Management Act 30 years ago was passed around about 1990, and it's calcified. And far too many property owners, asset owners, investors, the workforce are all joined in single call for it to be reformed. Now, that doesn't mean that we lurch towards some excessive tarmacking experience. It does mean, however, that we've got to be very realistic that without an economic surplus, no nation can look after its environment.
Getting the economy back on board requires urgency, but there are people saying the borders need to remain closed for months to come. That must be alarming for local small economies, small regional economies.
Well, obviously, with the Trans-Tasman bubble prospect and an extension over time, hopefully will alleviate the situation. The reality, however, is that we're going to have to reconfigure the way in which we generate revenue in New Zealand. We are not going to be immediately able to rely upon the 20 billion associated with international tourism being there for low-level fruit plucking. And the challenge for us is to turn to the other industries. You know, there's a Māori expression, te ipu kai, the food bowl. Regional New Zealand is a food bowl, and it's also a generator of great foreign exchange earnings. And I rather feel that Kiwis are going to have to move and regard those legacy industries with an enormous more respect than we have in our recent past.
Shane, small businesses were recently telling you they were pretty alarmed by sky-high interest rates, and you had a crack at the Reserve Bank. Are you still getting similar feedback from small businesses who are alarmed at the interest rates?
I'm 60 years old, and the last 30 years we've hollowed out the New Zealand ownership of our own banking industry. That's held by our Trans-Tasman cousins. So any Kiwi politician who's concerned about the cost of capital has to keep the pressure on our independent Reserve Bank. They effect better regulatory outcomes. My fear is that the Aussie-dominated banks are on a lending strike. That is intolerable, and we need to put enormous pressure on them because no economy can flourish in the absence of not only access to capital, but affordable access to capital. And someone like myself and my leader who really want to focus on the productive side of the economy, given the enormous challenges, debt, unemployment, you can expect to hear both of us talking very loudly about how the Reserve Bank must effect better outcomes from the Aussie-dominated banking industry in New Zealand.
Can I just say that there was a full-scale, for the fifth time, inquiry into banking practice in Australia by the Australian politicians and by Canberra. In my country, nothing. Now, you tell me that Ned Kelly's not behaving himself in Australia, but he's behaving himself in New Zealand? Well, that's a show of confidence in humanity. But you and I know better, so Shane is quite right. We need to ensure that banking practice in this country is fair and honest.
Well, will things change post-COVID-19?
I think the concept of the social license, it's not a term I grew up with, I must confess, but it's certainly one that a politician learns to not only appreciate. In all industries, they exist only if they can defend their social and moral entitlement to continue to operate. And I would say not only to the banking industry, to the insurance industry, to the power industry, because of the way in which economic power has congealed into limited numbers of institutions in New Zealand, that they need to be carefully regulated and they need to be constantly reminded that change is necessary. And if change does not organically come from their own board tables, politicians have the regulatory pistol to reach for.
Can I add one thing here? When you talk about the Trans-Tasman bubble or level 1, it's going to happen far more quickly than your cynics or skeptics or audience thinks. Guess why? Because the New Zealand people out there and the business and the workers and the general population is going to demand action, and they're starting to demand it now. Some of us got our ears wide open. We can hear it.
What's the outlook? Is forestry likely to make a strong recovery?
Well, forestry has grown in importance in regional New Zealand. In its raw form, it's highly sought after by our largest trading partner, China. But like a lot of these commodity industries, post-COVID, we've got to ensure that we capture the value in New Zealand. We've become too practiced at selling our commodities in a raw state and taking the spot price. I think that with unemployment figures growing, there's an expectation that the captains of industry and the politicians will find a way that we can invest in initiatives that expand the value that stays in our own country.
So what would that look like? We're talking here about making paper products instead of sending lumber offshore.
Well, obviously bioenergy, it may sound somewhat fanciful talking about it given the low current price of oil, but if we're very serious about our climate change challenges, we're a small, imaginative, innovative nation, bioenergy is going to be a big win-win as we go forward. And there's a host of other wood-based products that represent less of a carbon threat. We've got the raw material, we've got hydro energy, which is our main source of energy. They've got the opportunity to create products from the forestry sector that have been avoided and neglected in terms of investment decisions to date.
Winston, KiwiRail has unveiled new designs for 2 new greener high-tech ferries. How significant is that for jobs in Wellington and Picton?
Well, first of all, it's going to be a guaranteed connection between the North and South Island. The second thing, it'll be our first investment for 25 long years. And these 2 boats will be far bigger, in every way far more modern. They're rail enabled so that railway carriers can come on board. They'll do far more, those 2, than the 3 utilities we've got now. And we all know the Aotearoa has got a rather an appalling background of adjustments and engineering changes, and some of them have been downright embarrassing. So here we are, understanding as we have to, that this key infrastructural connection between the both islands has to be maintained, and we're making a serious investment in it. One of the things that most of us, and I'm sure you will have observed, that when you're traveling abroad, there are countries where they're doing things, where they're building infrastructure. What have we done here? Well, new garages and the greenhouses that you see in every city and town around the country. The warehouse. We built a warehouse everywhere and upgraded our garages. But where was the added value for the New Zealand workforce and the New Zealand economy? So we've got our eyes on the prize and we're not taking it off it.
So good news for infrastructure on both sides of the Cook Strait, and that's good news for the local economies.
Well, Shane Jones is in charge of so much of that infrastructure build, and a lot of those infrastructural changes will be essential things that should have been done decades ago, but can be done now. And when he says shovel ready, I mean, he means in a matter of weeks or months for the projects that we're prioritizing. But again, I say, traveling around countries, in other countries, and Australia is one of them, I'm seeing all this development and modernity happening in my country, stagnating on just, as I say, new garages everywhere and a warehouse everywhere. Now, frankly, it wasn't good enough. And I can just give you one comparison because we're talking about KiwiRail. Julius Vogel, between the 1870s and the 1880s, and it is the 1800s I'm talking about, built more rail with a much smaller population and with less utilities and no modern tools and equipment, built more rail in 10 years than we did for the next 130 years. Now, where in the world don't they have rail? Well, until we turned up, New Zealand.
Winston, you recently launched a COVID-19 vaccine strategy, which is great news for our scientists. What do you hope it will achieve?
Well, the miracle is that we get a vaccine and as fast as possible, but the investment was for both the science, the manufacturing, and also the disbursement, not just within New Zealand, but in our Pacific near neighbourhood to protect the health systems of the Pacific. And indeed, I say, because of our communication by transport and other means coming soon, to protect our own health and security.
The Washington Post reported this week that there are growing fears the virus may always be with us. We may never find an effective vaccine. Is that a situation your government has considered?
Yes, because we've been 40 years now since HIV turned up, and we still have not got a vaccine or solution to that. However, if you start down that pathway, then we'll never make any progress in any other area of the economy either. So we have to take the bull by the horn, so to speak, and realize that we may have that as a worst case scenario, but getting the economy back as fast as possible, both here and abroad, gives us the capacity to pay for the medical utilities we'll need.
Was there anything that you experienced in the lockdown or during the early stages of COVID-19 that changed the way you feel about what's important in life?
I discovered a level of resilience that I'm genuinely surprised I'm in possession of. Initially, I suppose I bridled, like a lot of other Kiwis, the imposition of no liberty. But once I realized the gravity of the situation, in the sense that my mother-in-law was staying with my wife and I, she's in her 70s, and over the years, she's had various health episodes. So, we had to be respectful of the fact that people were requiring, and I think expecting, senior figures of the political world to practice what they preach. So resilience was a big one for me.
And for you also, Winston, anything that changed in terms of what you see as important as a result of COVID-19?
Well, the danger of being away from Wellington and being connected only by the internet and by these sorts of programs was that nevertheless there were things that could possibly got away that we didn't know about. And so that was always a worry. And then the second thing is when you realize the magnitude of this, that it's probably the worst thing in 100 years, you could not be just relaxed in the same way, because your thoughts are not just on defeating COVID-19, but your thoughts are this level of calamity is going to take some serious focused thinking where we have learnt our lessons and learnt them very well to ensure that we cooperate regardless of our backgrounds, because it'll require the collective effort of every New Zealander. And so that if you are on a benefit and you can help the economy and you can volunteer, you should. If you can be retrained and get back into the work, you should. And if you're a business that's being asked to add value so that the wealth stays in this country and gives employment in this country, then you should. The period was very, very, and it still is very, very worrying, because the great test comes now. And this test is an economic test to ensure that we reach out to the business in other communities of this country to make sure that we don't make mistakes. We don't head out down the path of big government when smart government is what's required now, not big government.
Winston touched upon this, but if there was one thing you could change about the direction that New Zealand is taking in the future, what would that one single change be?
Singular purpose. 5 million people, a population that has expanded inordinately in a very short period of time. Our country must be possessed of a single purpose, and the purpose is not only to generate economic surplus in the short to medium term, but we must harness all of the talents, all of the skills, and be of a single mind under a single flag and under a single vision.
Winston, apart from getting out of lockdown much earlier, getting to number one much earlier, is there any other one thing you would love to see New Zealand do, one change you could make for our future?
Well, yes, I've seen it in our past, in the late 1800s in New Zealand, under a man who became the Prime Minister, Seddon, a very visionary person. Then I saw two parties, very different, head down the pathway of self-development in 1935, and then converted by the National Party to the philosophy of a property-owned democracy. where we made ourselves number 2 or 3 in the world, and we were. So what happened to us? Meanwhile, countries like Singapore that we were assisting under the Colombo Plan roared straight past us without any natural resources but their people. There are lessons to be learned from these economies, and it is that when you spend money, if you possibly can, you spend it on wealth creation, exports, and productivity, not on consumerism.
Can you think of any one country or economy that had shared goals and visions and managed to achieve them?
Well, I think a lot of people of my generation who had a bit of international experience, we are envious of how Singapore, devoid of any endowments of natural resources, but possessed of great human capital and a culture that is very results driven. If I think of a European country, we often compare ourselves with the Scandinavian countries. And one thing I admire about the Norwegians, they have had the ability to profit from exploiting their natural resources, care for the environment to the point that they have petrochemical industries right next to a salmon farm, and they both harmoniously coexist.
And Winston, you've mentioned a couple of countries, but again, same question. Is there any one time or any one country or economy you can point to say they had shared goals, they had shared vision, and they succeeded? What stands out for you?
Well, I recall, of course, the constant mantra of certain commentariat in this country who said that we need a bigger population. I go to Iceland, 342,000, getting 15,000 more per capita than us. No unemployment in a cold, freezing environment. Maybe because it's the cold, they think straight. Because you make a mistake, you die. Maybe we're too warm here, but my point is there's an economy, 342,000 people. Then you look, as Shane says, at Norway. It gets North Sea oil at the same time as the UK. One country spent it on tax cuts, the UK, the other country put it in a sovereign fund. So who was the socialist here? You work that out. And my point is, we could be that country because we're still seriously blessed as a nation. Magnificent scenery, tremendous water supply. We've got huge land resources. We've got the young people with the skills to be focused on the new economy and the IT world. Everything's at our fingertips, but we have got to change from our recent decades where we have not been a performer.
The optimists are saying that New Zealand has wonderful opportunities in front of us. We can become a world leader. We can make the most of this. The pessimists are saying the borders are going to stay closed. There's no cure. There's no vaccine. How are you feeling today? Are you apprehensive about COVID-19? Are you excited about what the future might hold? Fearful for your family? How are you feeling today?
Winston and I come from the very far north of New Zealand, the land where the treaty was signed. And we have a famous saying, he tangata, he tangata, he tangata. And that means the people, the people, the people. I trust infinitely in the capacity of our own people, and economy is people. And organically, I believe that we will derive the solutions. I'm naturally an optimist, after all. I am a politician. So I would say to you that we should draw and harness the talents of our people, because without that quality of intellect, without that drive, the natural resources will not generate the returns unless we marry first our economic ambitions, human capital, and use the resources in such a way that we grow, prosper, and have a better platform for the next